The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the Supreme Court's decision over the Robinson Treaties case was meant to correct a historic injustice. We examine the ramifications of that settlement. Then, Nam Kiwanuka speaks to the CEO of Feed Ontario about the rising use of food banks. That's ahead on the agenda. The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that Canada and Ontario have made a mockery of their treaty obligations to the Huron and Superior Anishinaabe First Nations. Here to discuss the settlement and whether it accomplishes what it set out to achieve, we welcome on Manitoulin Island, Ontario, Duke Pelletier, trustee and spokesperson for the Robinson-Huron Treaty Litigation Fund. He's a former chief of Wikwemikong unceded territory. On Birch Island, Ontario, right beside Manitoulin, David Nawegabo, legal counsel for the Robinson-Huron Treaty Litigation Fund and a partner at Nawegabo Corbière. In Garden River, Ontario, near Sault Ste. Marie, Chief Karen Bell of the Garden River First Nation. And with us here in studio, Harley Schachter, legal counsel for Red Rock and White Sand First Nations and a partner at the Duboff Edwards Schachter Law Corporation. And Harley, it's good to have you here. You've come all the way from Vancouver for this, so we're grateful. And to our three friends in Points Beyond, we're grateful you join us tonight as well here on TVO. I suspect this is a story that a lot of people sort of know a little bit about and have heard about, but I don't want to assume they know too much. So Harley, I want to start with you and just start with the basics. The Robinson Treaties are what?
The Robinson Treaties are treaties made in 1850 between Robinson, representing the government, and on behalf of the Anishinaabe. And it is an agreement by which the Anishinaabe agreed to share the territory with the newcomers by way of a treaty.
In exchange for what? They share the territory and...
In exchange for, the fundamental aspect was in exchange for a continuance of their way of life, in exchange for a share of the wealth, and in exchange for respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and renewal. Fundamental elements of Anishinaabe perspectives of law, which were adopted by the Crown.
How did you get involved in this case?
How did I get involved? 1995 or thereabouts, the chief of White Sand, who has since passed away quite a while ago, he had called me into his office to discuss a totally separate issue involving hydro. And we just got discussing, because I'm a fan of history, if you will, knew a little bit about the treaty, and we discussed why the treaty had not been honored, why the augmentation clause, the promise to increase the annuity, the share of the wealth, had never happened.
So your involvement in this goes back almost 30 years.
Yeah, almost, yes.
Amazing. Okay. David Nawegabo, how about you? How did you get connected to this?
Well, just maybe to add to Mr. Schachter's comments on the treaty, it's important to note that there are nation-to-nation agreements between the Anishinaabe Nation north of Superior and, of course, north of Lake Huron, and that those treaties were entered into with the Crown in right of Great Britain. That was the treaties were entered into in 1850, prior to the birth of Canada as we know it today. So the treaties were actually pre-Confederation treaties with the British Crown.
Good point. Now, how did you get involved?
I got involved. The interest in the action, the claim, was around probably as long as Mr. Schachter has been involved, since the 90s. Been a lot of work undertaken by the chiefs from the Lake Huron region to organize and try to come together to move the claim forward. For whatever reason, that didn't occur till probably about 10 years after the Red Rock and White Sand case was launched. That's when I became involved, and we started doing the research, and also because there are 21 First Nations in the Lake Huron region, there was an effort made to pull the 21 First Nations together, organized into a trust. And then we were able, after the research was done and the trust was organized, to launch the litigation.
You know what? It might be helpful at this point if we just brought up a map so we can show everybody what part of the world we're talking about. Sheldon, if you would, thank you. There's the graphic there. And for those who are listening on podcast and can't see this, let's just talk about what we're looking at right now. On one side, the highlighted Robinson-Superior Treaty region. On the other side, the region where the Robinson-Huron Treaty nations are located. And this wraps really north of Lake Superior, right around to, if you think of Lake Superior as a wolf's head, right past the eye of the wolf's head, then coming south and east, and really covering a significant swath of territory east of Lake Huron as well. Chief Bell, maybe I could ask you, why is this land considered so valuable to First Nations in this province?
So good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I could say, as recently elected chief in my position for one calendar year, that this area, this land, and actually the whole country has been very sacred to Indigenous people since time immemorial. And having a father who's in his 90s and shared and provided the understanding of the stewardship that we all have for the land, that is, I think, what is so important for people. Although treaties were signed, we are still responsible to ensure that the land is being kept sacred and is going to stay as pristine as possible that it can over time immemorial.
It was actually back in July that the Supreme Court of Canada made a decision regarding the Robinson-Superior Treaty, and here's part of what the court said in its decision. Today, in what can only be described as a mockery of the Crown's treaty promise to the Anishinaabe of the Upper Great Lakes, the annuities are distributed to individual treaty beneficiaries by giving them $4 each. For almost a century and a half, the Anishinaabe have been left with an empty shell of a treaty promise. Given the long-standing and egregious nature of the Crown's breach, a declaration alone will not help repair the treaty relationship or restore the Crown's honor. Duke Pelletier, that's some pretty tough language from the Supreme Court of Canada. How do you react to it?
Well, I think it's something that we expected the Supreme Court to really challenge the federal and provincial governments on their approach to honoring the treaty promises themselves. I think it's been very clear that the Anishinaabe peoples have been carrying the burden of treaty for over a century. And it's just now that the courts, that we've had to use these colonial systems to actually convince and compel the crowns to get back to the table and treat the treaty responsibilities with honor and respect.
Harley, I'd like to get your reaction too. When you read that from the Supreme Court of Canada, how did you react?
Well, it was a recognition that was long overdue. It was a recognition that I was glad to see, because my hope is it'll spur on some real action by the Crowns to make good on the promise.
David, it does not seem to have done so yet. In fact, the government of Ontario appealed the first two stages of the trial and then filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada a couple of years ago. Did you expect them to do that every step of the way?
It's important to note that Canada didn't appeal. Ontario did appeal. And it was unfortunate, really, that Ontario didn't take the occasion, at least even with the initial decision from the trial court, Justice Hennessy, to undertake good faith negotiations. But that's been a bit of the history of the Crown over the years, to be somewhat adversarial. We're hoping, as Mr. Schachter has indicated, that the Crown will change its tune now that the decision has been delivered by the highest court in the land, that the Crown needs to act more honorably, particularly with regard to these treaties, but with regard to treaties across the country.
Let me get Duke on that
many
as well.
outstanding claims.
Yeah, Duke, let me get you. How disappointed are you that the Ontario government has basically appealed every step of the way?
Well, I think the provincial government itself has clearly taken a legal approach. I think that we've heard a lot of great things from both levels of government coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples reports. However, as noted, some of the action is a lot slower than we would like. But we do know that on a political perspective, I believe that some of the leaders there truly do want to do something and have put forward an offer to truly sit down in a council fire. So we're hoping that the action is a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more quicker.
Well, David rightly pointed out that while the Ontario government has been appealing every step of the way, the federal government has not. And in fact, here's a statement from Crown Indigenous Relations, which goes like this. We welcome the Supreme Court of Canada's July 26 decision, which provides clarity on the annuity promise made in the Robinson-Huron Treaty and the Robinson-Superior Treaty. The Government of Canada did not file any appeals in the Restoule White Sand litigation and has sought a negotiated resolution with our treaty partners outside of the courts. We believe that is the best way to address outstanding issues and achieve reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is through negotiation and dialogue. We also welcome the Supreme Court of Canada's direction with regard to the Robinson-Superior Treaty and the White Sand litigation. We have begun this important work and we look forward to continuing those discussions directly with the First Nations and Ontario to advancing our joint work together at the negotiating table. Okay, Chief Bell, your reaction to that statement from Crown Indigenous Relations.
Well, I certainly think that, yes, we do need to have discussions and conversations. And, looking back in the history, this is way Indigenous people had conversations with the Crown, and it was in a circle, confederacy kind of a situation where, all the significant parties were sitting there, and there was lots of respect and dialogue and listening and consideration done. It was all done at that time, without any written rules on behalf of the First Nation and persons, people that were there at the time. And fast forwarded to the future now that we've had to adopt a colonial system and hire lawyers and legal entities to certainly negotiate and have conversations on our behalf, because we know that we cannot retrace history and go back to the ways we did. So we certainly think that we were not being recognized and afforded those opportunities. And so now today is the day that the First Nations in Ontario and in those treaty areas feel that we need to be more substantive and more standing forward in our comments and our concerns on what's going on and how we're going to move forward and ensure that our people prosper into the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, for what it's worth here, we did reach out to the Ministry of the Attorney General of Ontario for their comments on things. And, well, it's not quite as effusive as the Government of Canada's. Let's put it that way. Here's what they say. As the litigation relating to the Robinson-Superior Treaty remains before the courts, it would be inappropriate to comment. Period. Close quote. Now, regarding the Robinson-Huron settlement, we asked the AG's office for comment, but we didn't get anything back in time before we embarked on this program. So, okay, Harley, let's go at this now. Yeah. During the trial, we heard David mention Justice Patricia Hennessy in this. She apparently took an approach which integrated Anishinaabe law and Canadian law into that testimony into the court proceedings. An interesting mélange of the two. What did that actually look like in court?
What it looked like in court was you had ethno-historians testifying, you had Anishinaabe elders testifying, you had experts testifying about Anishinaabe perspectives. And the important part was the recognition that, and the evidence supported that coming into the treaty talks in 1850, Robinson adopted the Anishinaabe protocols, the Anishinaabe way of doing things, embraced them, and that was the core values that find their way into what Justice Hennessy said was respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and renewal.
Let me get Duke Pelletier on that. How important was it for you to see both traditions both legal histories represented in that courtroom?
Well, I think it's what should be noted is that our approach has always been that we require ceremony to begin anything that's important to our people. And I think having our elders, as well as ceremony, our Eagle staffs, our pipes being present in the courtroom was something that brought pride to many of our citizens. In the open court setting that was held in Little Current, many of the students were brought in by the bus, and it was something that they were fortunate to see that our own ways were on par with the common law system. And in fact, that the court itself accepted that our way of life was just as important and our perspectives were just as important as a common law system. So we got to bring a positive perspective into the court so that our younger children and younger generations would be able to see that it is a tool that could be used to address some of the good that we're seeking for our communities.
You mentioned Little Current. We should just point out for those who don't know, that is, I guess, the biggest town on Manitoulin Island in the northeast corner of the island, not too far from McWemkong, which is where you are. Chief Bell,
yes.
The $10 billion from last year's settlement has just been given to the Robinson-Huron Treaty nations involved. And I guess I want to find out, how do you figure out how to disperse that much money?
Well, this was a very convoluted conversations at the leadership table. Each nation was given X amount of dollars, and each nation then was to determine what they were going to do with those dollars. And I can tell you, for my community, being one of the larger First Nations, we had many discussions at the leadership table. We consulted elders, we consulted our youth, and we consulted our women on how did we see this money being distributed. And we knew as well that we were not going to distribute it totally 100% equally across the nation, because we wanted to ensure that 7 generations coming before us that will have some prosperity as well. And we wanted to ensure that if we didn't get the funding dollars that we consistently get, and maybe they deteriorate over the years, that we want to ensure that we could suffice and that we could propel ourselves into other negotiations into the future.
Duke, I'm going to ask you a very blunt and maybe some people will consider politically incorrect question, but here we go. Are there any concerns about what some community members might do with that money?
There's definitely some concerns, but I can reassure you that some of those concerns were unfounded. In fact, I've heard many positive responses from individuals that have clearly done what many people wish to do, and that is to give themselves a head start in their lives. Many people have become debt-free. Many people are building homes. Many people have paid down their mortgages. So it's reassuring to see that many of the concerns were clearly unfounded, that we were looking to short circuit, I guess. But I think at the end of the day, most of the individuals have clearly done good things with the funds that they received.
David, I want to follow up with you because, I may be misreading this, but you looked like you blanched a little bit when I asked that question, and I want to get your reaction to it.
Well, one of the really important points, and there are a shortage of funds all over, but the elders are really important for this, and we have a large population of elders, a lot of concern over their ability to survive and to live a comfortable life. So I think it's been a great contribution to the elders who had very little funds to live in their retirement years. So to be able to have a little more comfortable life, to not worry about food on the table and proper housing, or maybe a vehicle. I think those are some of the gratifying things that I've seen in the community. They don't have to worry about living day to day quite as much as they did prior to the settlement.
I don't know how much Harley's going to love this next question. Maybe I'll go to Chief Bell with this and let Harley just listen to it for a second. But Timmins Today reported that this summer, you and another chief brought a new case to court, and here's the quote, arguing that the legal fees need to be reassessed after the Robinson-Huron litigation fund overpaid lawyers by more than 400 million bucks. What's going on here?
Well, I could tell you that I want to be very minimal with my conversations on this. It's still before the courts, and that's kind of where I'm moving to thinking.
Harley, you want a word on this?
Look, lawyers do work. Lawyers deserve to get paid a fair and reasonable fee. The issue of what's fair and reasonable is before the courts, and I am quite happy and content to know that the judges understand what fair and reasonable means. My clients understand what fair and reasonable is. It'll never be a problem, I don't think, for me or the Hurons, because lawyers are only ever going to get paid what's fair and reasonable.
Okay. How did the $10 billion figure, how did they arrive at that?
Well, that you'd have to ask the Hurons. I can't speak to that.
Okay. Who wants to jump in on that one, the $10 billion?
Well, I think I can start with that there, Steve.
Okay, go ahead, Duke.
I think the turning point for the Hurons was that there was clearly an indication from the Court of Appeal that the Ontario Court of Appeal that they sided with the Hurons again, which set apart some discussions with both levels of government. And it was on through discussions with myself and Chief Dean Sayers, as well as both ministers. It was important for us to sit down clearly in a council fire, meaning that the ministers who were representing the Crown needed to sit down with all the leaders of the Robinson-Huron Treaty. So it was on December 5th of 2022 where we sat with them in Ottawa in ceremony, smoked our pipes with them, and it was clear that there was an indication that they wanted to clearly put forward a settlement amount for discussion. So through a series of discussions after this council fire, it clearly came into focus that there was an agreement that was imminent and needed to be considered and put before the leadership. So that was how the $10 billion amount came about.
Okay, now Harley, in one of the cases is it one of the other cases that you're on, somebody's asking for 126 billion, not 10 billion? That's quite a vast difference.
That is a difference.
Which tribe is that?
Well, that is the whole Robinson Superior Treaty bands. So while the Hurons settled for $10 billion, that offer was not made to the Robinson Superior bands. And so what the Robinson Superior bands did is they gathered their evidence, went to court, had a Nobel Prize winning economist, Professor Stiglitz from New York.
Joe Stiglitz?
Yes.
We've had him on this program. He's a big deal.
He is a big deal, tremendous guy, very, very eloquent, intelligent. He gave evidence. We actually did the work required to prove what the wealth was from the Robinson Superior Territory that was available to be shared, and the highest number is 126 billion. Now, that's assuming various assumptions like rates of return that are favorable from the First Nation perspective, but reasonable, that were supported by Professor Stiglitz. But the range in court was anywhere from Ontario took the position that it was minus $4 billion to up to 126 billion. So if you can imagine, Ontario came to court in stage 3 and argued and said, you know, this territory has been a drain on the provincial coffers. We've lost $4 billion over the years. So there's nothing to share. So it makes it difficult with that kind of approach to reach a settlement. I'm hopeful that through the process that the Supreme Court of Canada has demanded, there will be a breakthrough.
David, I guess people have to remember here that what you and others are trying to right are wrongs that have been committed for about 175 years. And if the numbers seem very big, it's because the time First Nations have waited for justice is very long. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. In fact, the Supreme Court of Canada cited some of what they had to say. They were pretty clear in indicating that there may be a sticker shock to some of these numbers, but it's because the breaches have been egregious and for so long. As Duke indicated, for the Robinson Huron Anishinaabe. There was an interest in getting a settlement. We could have litigated for a longer period of time, and was concerned about how long this would take and fatigue setting in. We're hopeful that the Superior First Nations will come to an agreement with the Crowns, but that's for them to decide. In the Robinson-Huron context, the numbers were also very significant, and the way that the chiefs wanted that to be known, because the numbers, the value of the territory over 150, 170 years was, for the Huron region, was in the neighborhood of about 500 billion. You know, that is actually the contribution that the Anishinaabe have made to the Ontario and to the Canadian economy, according to Professor Stiglitz, who was retained initially by the Robinson-Huron Treaty Litigation Fund to bring forward evidence of value of the territory. But that is an impossible number really for the Crowns to pay. So it was out of a consideration for the value and an interest in moving forward with reconciliation, getting the treaties implemented. Of course, there's also an important value to the go-forward aspect of the treaty implementation.
Well, let me pick up on that if I
$10 billion
can. Yeah, let me pick up with Duke on that if I can, because with just a few minutes to go here in our discussion, I think it's worth trying to figure out the overarching significance of coming to an agreement, of all sides coming to an agreement here, and what that would mean for future relations going forward. Duke, can you help us understand that?
Well, I think just to pick up a little bit on David's comments, the intention of the leadership in the Robinson-Huron was to ensure that our elders who are currently living also receive some benefit. So that had a hand in allowing for that decision to be made to accept the agreement. But it was also clearly stated by our leaders that they wanted to ensure that the relationship was renewed, it was respected, and that the responsibility of the treaty itself and implementing the treaty was done to the fullest extent, and that was going to be done through respectful relationships with the Crown, with them sitting down with our leaders on a regular and annual basis to discuss the treaty and their obligations.
Chief Bell, can I get you on the, and I have to say parenthetically here, the current federal government, I think most fair observers would say, have taken some significant steps over the years in trying to improve reconciliation. Not perfect, but they've made some progress. How significant a piece of the puzzle would be getting this right in terms of improved relations among First Nations and the rest of Canada?
Yes, so all of Canada is aware of our $10 billion settlement agreement, and Canada also is aware that the Indigenous people of this country and Indigenous people in this area particularly are going to stand up, and we want to embrace our neighbors. We want to have a fruitful life like everyone else, and I think that in the movement of what's going on currently across the country is that Canada now is realizing and understanding and saying, hey, we didn't do such a great job and we want to do better. And the way we're going to do better is to have good shared relationships with our Indigenous folk across the country. So I do applaud Canada for trying that. And as you stated, it's not the best, but it is getting better. And we're making the inroads daily to have embraces with all of our partners, all of our friends, all of our neighbors, whether it be in government, industry, or anywhere else. So yes, I do agree that we are moving forward in a good path.
Harley, I got 30 seconds left. Put a bow on this discussion for us, if you would.
Okay, I guess, to borrow a phrase, Canada can be great again. A healthy, prosperous Anishinaabe nation taking its rightful equal part in Canadian society, it helps all Canadians. All Canadians should be happy with the Huron settlement. All Canadians should look forward to a healthy and prosperous Anishinaabe nation as equals. And it's a great thing for Canada if that happens.
You really want to take a Donald Trump slogan, eh, and wrap up the discussion with that. Harley, okay, your call, very good.
My attempt at humor.
It worked. Thanks, everybody, for participating in our program tonight. Chief Karen Bell, Duke Pelletier, David Nabagabo, Harley Schachter. It's been great having you on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Miigwech.
Mitch.
More than 1 million Ontarians visited a food bank in the last year, the 8th year in a row that number has increased. And the future doesn't look much better. 2/3 of the groups that make up Ontario's food bank network say they fear they will not be able to meet future demand, leaving people hungry. For a look at the causes of the problem and ideas on how to address it, we're joined by Carolyn Stewart, CEO of Feed Ontario. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's really nice to have you in studio because a few weeks ago when you announced this astronomical figure of 1 million Ontarians now using food banks, you asked people to remember that this wasn't just a stat. Why was it important for you to make it clear that this number represents adults, seniors, children, the people in our communities?
Such a great question. You know, I think sometimes with statistics, people and faces get lost in the numbers. But what we try to make sure people understand is that these are neighbors in your community. You know, unfortunately, hunger doesn't discriminate here in Ontario or anywhere across Canada, quite frankly. And so we're seeing people from all walks of life. And realistically, times are getting incredibly challenging for so many people. And so when we hear this number, we don't want it to just be something that sits on the back burner. But the next time, you know, you go to work, you think it could be potentially my colleague. It could be a child sitting beside my child in a classroom. It could be someone sitting next to me on the bus. That's members of your community that are struggling every single day to put food on the table.
You know, when you hear that number, 1 million people in this province not having enough food to eat, you think, how can that be happening in a province like Ontario? Because Ontario is a wealthy province. Is it wrong to think that Ontario is a province that's doing well?
I think you have to look at different parts of data to determine what well means to you, right? And so, yes, certain statistics, like if we look at jobs, you know, we're creating jobs, which is great. Are they the right kinds of jobs? Are they paying people a livable wage? Do they provide benefits? Do they provide sick days? Are they providing equal pay for equal work? Because we're seeing a growing number of employed individuals accessing food banks. On the other side, is it somewhere where housing's accessible or affordable? You know, when we look at food bank clients, they're spending over 70% of their monthly income on housing, leaving very little for everything else. Does Ontario have proper supports in place? So does their social assistance programs provide the support that's needed to make cost of living every single month, which right now, unfortunately, they don't. We're looking at rates that we saw in 1993 comparable to today. And so all of these things really contribute to a successful and thriving province. But realistically, when over 1 million people, so I think that's close to 1 in 14 Ontarians are having to access a food bank just to get by. So that's not even to thrive or survive. That's just to get by every month. To me, that demonstrates that this province is not successful when our most vulnerable are not able to meet their most basic needs.
1 in 14, that means our neighbors, people that we might know. And you said that 70% people are spending 70% of their income on housing. So that's not obviously like a budgeting problem. It's not that people aren't budgeting correctly. Who would you say is using the food banks?
Great question. So we are seeing people from all walks of life. About 30% of those that we service are children. Now 1 in 6 people is employed. Over 50% of adults are on some form of social assistance, so that's on the Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Program. Even we see seniors. We're seeing a growing number of students. So we now have a food bank on every university campus in the province because really everyone's being affected by the cost of living crisis, the inflation, and then the compounding effects of the pandemic are really affecting those who are already on the cusp, are unfortunately falling into poverty and looking for assistance, and so they're having to turn to the food bank.
You mentioned the cost of living, jobs. Does the cost of groceries play a role? Because I think if anyone goes to the grocery store, things cost more. We're dealing with shrinkflation.
Yes.
Is that playing a role in people not being able to afford groceries?
Yeah, affordability of any kind is really impacting, people can only stretch a dollar so far. And really we're seeing the results of decades of underinvestment, right? Mm-hmm. We're seeing decades of underinvestment into social programs. So, Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program provides you less than 50% below the poverty line. So, you can barely make ends meet on that. But then we're looking at housing. We have stopped building purpose-built housing over the last 2 decades. So, rental tenants. So 90% of food bank clients are rental tenants or social housing tenants. So when we're not building the type of housing that people need, all of these things are starting to compound and making things increasingly unaffordable or inaccessible. And then we've added a pandemic. We've added inflation, and then we've added the affordability crisis that we're seeing now. And so groceries, when making difficult decisions every month, people are saying, do I pay my rent or do I buy food? Do I get my medication, which I desperately need, or do I buy food? And because there's an alternative for food at the food bank, people are having to make that very difficult choice. And so we're seeing the demand increase astronomically as people try to make those difficult choices every day.
That seems like an impossible situation to be in. Yes. When you have to decide whether or not you should pay your rent, or whether or not you should buy your groceries, or whether or not you should be getting your medicines. What worries you most about that situation when people have to make those difficult decisions?
I think sometimes people get the impression that people who are accessing food banks do it by choice, right? They've made, they should just get up, or that old age allowed to go get up and get a job and you'll be fine. But 1 in 6 people that we're seeing is employed, and that's the fastest rising group of food bank clients is actually employed individuals. So, it's no fault of their own. I was recently on a media interview where people called in, and it was, they were seeing a marital breakdown. They experienced health problems, so they had to burn through their savings, and they didn't have benefits provided through their work. There are all sorts of scenarios and life challenges that direct people to have to need assistance. And so what worries me so much is that people don't understand that social safety nets are supposed to be built to protect us during those hard times when so many things are outside of our control, that to help us get back on our feet. But the lack of focus on those programs over so many years has meant that people have nowhere to turn and are having to make these impossibly hard decisions. I can't imagine having to decide between buying food or a winter coat for my child, or having to decide, can I get to work that day on transit, or do I keep my lights on? These are the decisions that people that are visiting our services are having to make every single day, and not one of those decisions. They're having to make countless of those decisions every single day just to make it to the end of the month.
Like you're thinking the amount of stress that people are going through when you think that we live in such a rich country, a rich province. And you mentioned that people, because I think people have an idea, maybe a stereotype of who accesses food banks. And you mentioned that some of these people are working. I've also read that some people who have homes, who own their homes, are also accessing food banks. How many of your users are employed full-time or hold multiple jobs?
So when we're looking at it, I think it's almost 25% of adults who are accessing our services hold employment. And so many of the time when we're talking about people who are accessing services, they may potentially be on minimum wage or very frequently hold multiple jobs, so multiple gig jobs. So that's another huge issue that we're seeing affecting food bank use is the types of jobs. So, 1 in 10 workers now in the province is employed under the gig economy. They're not covered by the Employment Standards Act. And so they don't get the proper supports and or coverage or protections as someone with a full-time job with benefits and proper pay. They're also not eligible for federal programs like employment insurance, depending on how many hours and how that plays into it. And so all of these protections, again, that were supposed to be built, were built in a time where people work 9 to 5. They had the same job for 30 years. They didn't work multiple.
They had a pension.
They had a pension, all those really wonderful things that were protections. The systems were built in that time, and they haven't modernized to reflect the living of today. And that's the problem. You know, we're here living in today, but the systems aren't meeting our demands.
Yeah, people have to figure out how to survive. Another group is students, because when you're a student, not only do you have to worry about going to your classes, getting good grades, maybe even working part-time, but if you're working part-time, maybe you don't have the means to eat properly and afford the groceries.
Yeah, so really, you know, food insecurity is an income issue, having sufficient income to be able to afford your most basic necessities. So anyone who's on a limited income, like a student or a senior or someone who has a very basic income, they don't have that flexibility if 1 month cost of groceries gets very expensive or their car breaks down and they need to fix it. All of those are just one-off expenses that you're unprecedented. When those throw a wrench in their plans, then it becomes very hard to navigate how they're going to make it to the end of the month. You know, ultimately, that's why food banks were created in the 80s, right? During the recession in the 80s, there was that kind of period of time. There was about 3 days for people to get to the end of the month, and that was what we were that emergency stopgap measure to get people to the end of the month. But what we've seen since then is that we've become increasingly relied on to fill the gaps in that social safety net when disinvestments in those programs have happened. And so we're seeing more and more people access food banks because the government support programs and systems are not there to provide the supports that they're supposed to help get people back on their feet, and for those who can work, get back to work.
You're an essential lifeline. I am going to bring up the government in just a little bit.
Yeah.
But you've stated in a previous interview that, quote, many of those former donors, people who give food to food banks, are in fact turning to food banks for support. What does that say about the state of food banks and how close people in this province are to not having anywhere to turn to?
You know, I think it really speaks to the precarity and fragility of our network right now. You know, we weren't built to withstand this level of demand, nor how quickly it has grown. So we've seen 135% increase in the amount of visits since pre-pandemic numbers, right? Like in the last year, a 25% increase. And so, you know, food banks are really struggling to keep up, particularly because we rely on the generosity of individuals and companies to support our needs. Food banks are not government funded. Some receive some regional or municipal support, but most receive no government funding. And so we rely on those individuals to make sure that we can operate. But in many communities, there's a fine line between those who are accessing the food banks and those who are providing those generous support. And so when you don't have that extra dollar at the end of the month, you know, you can only stretch the dollar so far, and people are having to stretch dollars very far as housing increases, as cost of living increases, as groceries increase. They have less money for those extras, and so they can no longer donate. And when we saw many people on the cusp, we have food banks reporting they're now seeing donors as clients to their services. And so, you know, I think that just reflects the really true reality that anyone may be in need of a food bank in some point in their life, and also that something needs to change, right? That's not the community. I don't think that's what anyone in Ontario wants to see in their community or in their province. And I think we can do a lot better.
We want to see people thrive.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about people who are on limited incomes or fixed incomes because you can't really find money elsewhere. Could you please explain how restrictions on social programs like Ontario Works or the Ontario Disability Support Program could be driving more people to access food banks?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you know, both those programs put you significantly below the poverty line. And in many cases, the system for Ontario Works was actually built as a temporary solution for when people can't find work and to get back on their feet. But right now, if you're on Ontario Works, you know, you get $733 a month. The average one-bedroom apartment is somewhere around $2,000. So even if we're talking about housing alone, you're far surpassing that. then you're supposed to be able to afford transit to work. You're supposed to afford food to be able to have the energy to work, all of those wonderful things. And so it keeps you in a position where it's almost legislating you into poverty, right? We're asking, the Ontario government did great in tying the Ontario Disability Support Program to inflation in 2018, I believe it was, so that the program increases along with cost of living. They did not do that with Ontario Work. So I think that's that's one of the recommended changes that our organization makes to make sure that it's keeping in line with that, but also increasing the rates so at least people have the income they need to get back on their feet. And for someone living with a disability, there are all those extra additional costs, medication, extra supports, transit needs, housing needs that differ significantly from an average individual. And so all of those considerations are needed when making changes to program. Again, I go back to what I say around modernizing programs. We have to make sure it reflects the realities that someone's living as opposed to what you want them to live, right? And to make those changes so that the programs are effective, because the more effective they are, the less people need to rely on them.
Well, you mentioned the government. What are some steps governments could take to lessen the number of people using food banks right now?
Yeah, our recommendations really center around three key things. So labor and jobs, social assistance, and housing. For labor and jobs, what we talked about at the beginning, so making sure that there's things like equal pay for equal work. Even something as simple as a paid sick day can make a huge difference for people. If they're, do I stay home with my sick child or miss my shift and not pay rent that much? Those are huge things. They seem inconsequential, but they're massive for people. Making sure that the ESA reflects today's living. For housing, meeting those targets outlined in the National Housing Strategy or even surpassing them to ensure that we're accessing or creating the access to housing. Making sure that we're putting in rent protections, because right now that's a huge issue with 90% of the people that visit our services on renters, sorry. And so when rent is increasing so astronomically year over year, it's creating a lot of issues here in Ontario. And really social assistance, as we talked about, making sure that we're raising the rates, we're reducing clawbacks in the program so that we're incentivizing going back to work. And, there's more outlined details on these recommendations on our website, which I encourage everyone to go take a look at.
As a mother and just someone that lives in this province has benefited from being in Ontario, it's really heartbreaking to know that there are children, youth that need to access food banks. In April, the federal government announced the National School Food Program. Has that program made a noticeable difference in the number of kids that access food banks?
So it's still being rolled out. So I don't think it's had the impact yet, but it is a huge step forward. Even knowing that there's a guaranteed meal coming somewhere can make a huge difference for, families that are really trying to make it to the end of the month and have sufficient food, nutritious food to feed their children. I know the federal government has just released investments in terms of making sure that organizations have the proper capacity to support this growing program. But I do think that's an incredible step in the right direction to ensure that parents can feed their kids, because oftentimes in food insecure households, we're seeing parents skipping meals to feed their children, having to make less healthy choices to have sufficient food to make it to the end of the month, and a lot of difficult choices around those sorts of decisions. So a school nutrition program is so essential in providing that extra bit of security for children every single day, a guaranteed meal that's healthy, nutritious, and supportive.
We're in the holiday season, and when you think about 1 million people who are faced with making the difficult choice of buying rent or buying groceries or getting their essential medicine, is what's happening right now, do you think, in your opinion, is this a canary in the coal mine for potentially a bigger crisis if more isn't done to help people out?
We do. It keeps me up at night, to be quite honest. There was a study done in McMaster University with our member Hamilton Food Chair that stated, food banks are that last line of defense before homelessness, because people are having to make those difficult choices. And so if food banks can no longer provide the support to everyone, it means we're going to see more individuals having to be unhoused, to be homeless, and then that isn't even more significant crisis we are seeing on our hands. We know that there's already a housing and homelessness crisis in this province, but if we can no longer keep up with demand, then we're going to see more people having a difficult choice on their hands. And so we are trying to ring the alarm bells to make sure people understand the severity of the situation that we're seeing here in Ontario, and to truly understand that, food insecurity is one symptom of poverty and a much larger complex issue. And we don't think there's any silver bullet to addressing it, but there are definitely policy levers that can be pulled to help turn the tide on this and help make sure it doesn't get worse than it already is.
We know that Ontarians are very generous. We've seen during the pandemic how people came together to help one another. If people, watching at home would like to help, what is the best way for them to go about helping food banks?
Yeah, if people have the capacity, we're so grateful for your support. You can, visit your local food bank. All of them have lists of food, most needed items online. You can visit our website, feedontario.ca. For every $1 donated to our organization, we can provide the equivalent to 2 meals to someone in need, or even donate food at your local food bank, your local grocery store, or if you're here in the GTA, you can even donate at a local fire hall, and they'll drop it off for you as well. So really even a single dollar can help make sure that we can keep our doors open and continuing to provide support while we find those solutions.
Our appreciation to Feed Ontario and the work that you are all doing to raise this alarm and for us to reach our hand out to help our neighbors in need. Thank you so much for your time, Caroline.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
On June 8th at the Hamilton Museum of Steam and Technology, the Canadian Society of Contemporary Iron Art got together for a public pour. We had a pretty great turnout. It was 700 people came to see it. There was a core group of members who originated the Iron Pour group. They started out as a dinner party and slowly worked their way towards building a furnace. The temperature of the furnace is brought up to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt the iron. The furnace was filled with many charges of iron, all collected from radiators around southern Ontario. So there were 1,500 pounds of iron that went into it, and this is a kind of continuous feeding of the furnace throughout the day. And then as the charges fill the furnace, it's tapped, and then the molten metal pours out and enters the ladle. It's very heavy. The ladle weighs about 150 pounds when it's fully filled. The role of the people in the shovel is to protect the hand and the other molds from the pouring iron. Most of the molds that were there on the day at the Steam Museum were 2-part molds. The molds are made out of a resin-bonded sand that is activated by CO2 to cure the resin within the sand. Scratch blocks are also made from the same sand. But it's an open face, and it allows people to same day go in and carve the surface there and produce a piece to take home with them. And so it's a lot less prep time and more accessible, good first way to have an entry point to work with iron. It's a very unique metal to be using because it is so accessible and so affordable. You can pretty much get iron anywhere. Iron is often not even accepted by scrapyards because its value is so low. On the day of the event, when everyone comes together, you're pretty much just responding intuitively to how the metal looks, how it flows in the moment. You're looking to all these hints within the metal, within the surface as it's melting to show you how you're going to end up responding to it. It's the surface of the metal, it's how it looks in the furnace, It's how it starts to like slowly drip out the side. These are all indications of when you're going to be coming in and ready to like tap the furnace. It's kind of a call and response between the organization of people there on the site and also a call and response with the furnace itself. This is a found frame collected with 2 river stones embedded within the center of it. And so you can see the attachment here from the gating system where the pour cup would have been outside of the sand cast. Here's where the metal fills in its molten state, and then it slowly drops down into the base here and fills out through the runners that are all these little connection points. And so it's covered in the sand, but as you work away and kind of clear it off, you end up with more of the details underneath. It's a really intuitive kind of process. Something I think about a lot is the apparent permanence of metal. It's something we think of as like rigid, unyielding, something that doesn't change much. And with this permanence, you kind of end up with its counterpart, reclaiming, reworking, melting down, tempering. All these ways that you can kind of renegotiate the material's form. It's very forgiving.
And that is the agenda for Monday, October 7th, 2024. What does having one corporation owning all Toronto sports teams mean? We're talking Rogers tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Thread with Nam Kiwanuka is back for a new season. Connect anytime on Instagram and watch full episodes on YouTube or tvo.org/thethread.